Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Jennifer Kovich-Bordnick. I'm the CEO of the eHealth Initiative and Foundation, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today, What's Ahead in 2020 for Consumer Privacy. This is the first in a series of webinars on privacy. And Claudia is with me today, going to be helping with the slides. Thank you, Claudia. We've got a great agenda today. We're going to hear today from two experts in privacy, which I'm really just delighted to have join us. And we'll hear from both of them. We're going to have a little bit of a back and forth discussion, and then we'll have time for Q&A there at the end. So let me tell you a little bit about who we have with us today. First of all, I'm really delighted that we have Leiter with us today, who is the eHealth Initiative's new Senior Counsel and Vice President. Prior to eHealth Initiative, and we are so happy that she's with us. She was a Senior Associate in Health Regulatory Practice at Hogan Lovells and did a lot of work in health information privacy and law policy. She worked on HIPAA compliance, helping draft notices of privacy practices for companies, BA agreements, all of that fun stuff. Spent a lot of time working with HIEs, insurers, pharmaceutical companies, and trade associations. Before that, many of you might have remembered her from her time at the National Partnership for Women and Families, and she was also at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Did a lot of work at both organizations where we got to know her well, serving as really a consumer advocate on privacy issues as well. And she also right now sits on the DC Health Information Exchange Policy Board. So welcome, Alice. We're happy to have you today. We also have with us today Alaap Shah. Alaap is fantastic. He works at Epstein Becker Green, focuses on defense and counseling of healthcare entities on legal and regulatory compliance, a lot of work around privacy, cybersecurity, and data asset management. Prior to that, he's got a lot of background experience working on big data analytics, digital health strategies. He was the Senior Counsel and Chief Privacy and Security Officer at an oncology society prior to that, and has done a lot of work around big data. So we're really fortunate to have both of these stellar folks here joining us today. And we'll get started in just a moment. A couple of housekeeping items before we get there. All of you have been muted today, so if you'd like to ask a question, you can ask a question a couple of different ways. There is a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and if you click on that box, we would really like you to click on that box and enter your questions in that way. If you have a technical issue, an issue looking at the slides or with your sound, please go into the chat box at the bottom. But we would like questions for the speakers to come through that Q&A queue down at the bottom, so just click on that queue there. And I believe Ali in our office has already sent out a link to the slides for today's presentation, so that's available right now for download if you click on the link in your chat box. For those of you who are not familiar with our mission, we basically convene executives from every stakeholder group in healthcare to identify and share best practices around technology and innovation. And we've got a number of different focus areas that we're working on right now. A lot of work around value-based care, interoperability. We're doing a lot of work around FHIR and helping people understand FHIR and what it means in Da Vinci. You'll be seeing this webinar series on privacy and security roll out over the next several months. And then we've done a lot of work around SDOH. Hopefully you've had a chance to download our ethical principles around the appropriate use of social determinants of health. So we will continue to do work in those 4 areas this year. And if you want to get a peek at all of this great information, there are a load of resources related to privacy, SDOH, analytics, FHIR, et cetera, all available for free in our eHealth Resource Center. You just have to go to ehidc.org/resources. Hundreds and hundreds of pieces of content there, surveys, reports, all kinds of best practices available for you to download. We are a nonprofit, so we're doing this for you. We're doing this for the general public, and we encourage you also to go ahead and upload any best practices or reports that you have. This is an open forum, so if you've done some work at your organization and would like to share a report, we encourage you to upload those. And if we see something we really like, we'll go ahead and share it and send it out to the rest of our membership there. Next slide. Okay, and I'm going to turn it over to Alice now, who's going to walk us through the rest of the program. Alice.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you everyone for joining us. I have been an enthusiastic audience member of countless EHI webinars in my prior life, but to be on the other side and be officially in the EHI family has been a real honor and a pleasure, and I'm delighted to kick off our privacy webinar series. We couldn't think of a better topic for January than to talk about what's ahead for the year when it comes to consumer health privacy. The topic of this webinar is really going to focus on legal protections and what the current state is and what's coming. But I'm going to start, if we could see the next slide, with an overview of the fastest State of the Union you've ever heard on where we are with consumer health. And then I'll turn it over to Alaap, and he's going to talk a little bit about HIPAA's role in consumer health and consumer-directed health, what the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT is working on with respect to some much-needed HIPAA updates, and then what we can learn from international law, where we might be going, what's going on the state level, and then what the feds have in store for us, what's likely to pass, or as it may turn out, not pass. So next slide. When we think about consumer health now, you can't talk about that without talking about iPhones and understanding the increasing consumer reliance on personal technology devices. They're not just for phone calls and emails and texts and stalking your exes and figuring out what vacations they've all taken. Increasingly, personal health devices and applications are being used to manage almost every aspect of health, whether that is fitness tracking or nutritional intake, blood pressure monitoring, fertility tracking. I truly cannot think of a health-related area or dynamic where there is not an app that you can find to manage or help you with that. And that has led to a rapid expansion in the volume of electronic health data that's available. It already has been and is continuing to expand as providers migrate their record systems from paper to electronic records, and as insurers continue to amass vast troves of electronic data from their clients. But when you factor in also all of us who are uploading our own information, the universe of health data, or health-ish data even, that we talk about is just truly mind-boggling. And the good news is that the expansion of the volume of data comes with expansion of the potential for what to do with it. Big data on the health front has the potential not only to lead to tailored individual health solutions to improve individual health care, but if you think about it on a population health or population management standpoint, it's just truly astronomical, the potential that all of this data holds. I guess the downside of that, though, is that the rapid expansion in both the volume and the potential is outpacing at a pretty rapid clip the ability of legislators and regulators to keep up and make sure that the requisite protections are in place to keep that data both private and secure. Legislators and regulators are mere mortals, and they just can't keep up with the innovation in technology and the individual appetite for more, and learning the next best thing and wanting to be part of it. So we'll hear a little bit about the gaps in HIPAA. The law is increasingly outdated, and states are doing the best they can to fill the gaps. But again, the delta between the volume and the potential and the protections in place on the legal front is increasingly widening. The downside of that gap is that as the enthusiasm and the potential just keeps growing, the lack of protections or lack of adequate protections is leading, unfortunately, to a gap in consumer trust as well. It's interesting to think about how eager we all are to share our data, and at the same time, if we're asked, or the vast majority of us are asked, do you think it's secure? Do you think it's kept private? Most of us say no. And so fortunately, there are a bunch of nerds like us who are thinking very hard about what to do about that. And I'm grateful that Alaap will be outlining some of the things that we are doing to close that gap. The next slide Alaap put together, and I love it. It shows the trajectory of health IT and sort of what the big game in town is. In the olden days, when I started my practice, it was HIPAA, the HITECH Act, which was passed as part of the stimulus legislation. There was a massive incentive program as part of the HITECH Act for providers to adopt electronic health records. And that was very exciting. And then everybody started migrating to EHRs and moved past personal health records and started talking about digital health and big data and what to do about big data and what that meant for us. And now we've even moved past that to artificial intelligence and its capacity to revolutionize healthcare yet again. Not only these days is it going to be your phone that helps you manage your diet, but soon now your refrigerator can help do that through the so-called Internet of Things. That really refers to the increasing number of devices. Oops. Sorry, am I still there? I apologize.
Yes, you're still here.
Okay. I cannot see the slide anymore. I'm sorry, I got a phone call. That's embarrassing, but I will say that here we are. The Internet of Things really refers to the increasing migration of household appliances and other electronic devices onto the internet. And the next slide graphically shows this preference that consumers have, this enthusiasm that we all have for digital healthcare solutions over the outdated paper or sadly in-person solutions that we have to so many things in healthcare. Most of us would prefer to choose a health plan or doctor online rather than some other way. You want to have digital access to your health record, be able to electronically monitor your health metrics, pay bills, order prescription refills. And this slide really points to this huge enthusiasm that people have for digital health solutions. But when it comes to the trust gap and the legal and regulatory outdated nature, the outdated legal and regulatory nature to match the digital health environment, we have to figure out what to do about it. And there are a number of different things that we can and should and should be and are doing to address all of this. We're working to close the gaps in HIPAA. We are increasingly relying on the FTC for enforcement of company privacy policies for those companies and tech platforms that are not covered by HIPAA. FTC has an enforcement role in making sure they adhere to their terms of use. As I said, the states have been wonderfully active in trying to shore up protections for personal data, personal health data, and specifically sensitive health information. Alaap will talk about the GDPR, the European Union's comprehensive personal data protection law. And it's interesting to see how the US is going to react to that and whether or not that's going to be a bellwether for our own federal action. And then, of course, there's some non-legal things that we should and need to be doing. Better consumer education, consumers need to understand what HIPAA is, what it covers, what it doesn't cover, the transparency with respect to uses and disclosures of health data that we upload into these technology apps. Terms of use are something that have a great deal of potential but are often overlooked, and so there's a lot to be done on the front of increasing consumer understanding of what happens to that data once it's uploaded. And then there are really some exciting opportunities in the private sector for what the healthcare stakeholders can be doing to both innovate on the front of privacy protections, to educate their consumers about what they're doing with their data, both for good and on the protective front, and even maybe some self-governance options as we wait for the feds to take action to close the federal regulatory and legal gaps. So as I said, that's a rapid fire state of where we are. And I'm really thrilled that Alaap is here to break it down into more nitty-gritty detail for us. Jen gave him a great introduction. I'm going to come back to him at the end for a discussion, and I turn it over now to Alaap.
Thanks, Alice, and thank you, Ihai and Jen and Claudia for including me in this webinar and its inaugural sort of kickoff for the privacy initiatives that you have. I'm honored to be here. So this is me. Next slide, please. This is a little bit about me. So as was mentioned earlier, I'm a partner at Epstein, Becker & Green in their Healthcare Life Sciences division, and I'm a co-chair of the Data Privacy, Cybersecurity, and Data Asset Management team. It's a mouthful, but you know, as we'll talk about more in this presentation, data is becoming such a central point of how people transact, how they value their business, and how they ultimately glean the insights they need to power the healthcare industry. So we're going to talk a lot about that and how it's being shared and how it can be shared and protected responsibly. And then prior to that, as Jen mentioned, I worked at ASCO and helped start a bunch of initiatives over there, big data initiatives, leveraging real-world oncology data to help patients at the point of care by analyzing that data and providing insights to clinicians. Next slide, please. So I love starting with this. This is sort of the meta view of what's happening in the market and why data is so critical. In terms of consumerism in healthcare, data really is king. It is the fuel by which healthcare specifically operates, but increasingly every industry is operating. It's the lifeblood. So going back to that slide that Alice presented with the trajectory of sort of HIT 1.0 to HIT 3.0, data is critical to the success at any point in that trajectory. And while we spent the first, decade of time since the passage of high tech, building all the pipes, adopting all the technology, and we continue to do so, the pipes and the technology are just a means to more efficiently and effectively gather data, move it along the path to wherever it needs to be to provide care in an efficient and effective manner and get paid for that care, and then innovate to help quality improvement over time. So really, the data all the while was really the asset, and the insights gleaned from the data is the most valuable piece. And this is something the Economist recognized and essentially, put on their magazine a couple of years ago. And they took a look at it not from a healthcare specific lens, but they said, look, we're looking at the largest market cap companies, the most valuable companies in the world, and they continue to be so today. These are companies that live and breathe on data. This is how they operate, and they have a mission to amass more and more over time. And by doing so, they improve their business. And I postulate here, I argue that that's sort of the same position that healthcare companies or companies getting into the healthcare space are thinking about. And you'll see even these tech giants, they're moving into the healthcare space as well, because healthcare, as you all know, is such an information-rich environment. So again, there's no surprise that we're going to see more and more movement of technology companies into the healthcare space beyond just building pipes. Now it's going to be more about using that data in novel ways to innovate and provide insights at the point of care and otherwise. Next slide, please. So here's some recent headlines, some as recent as a few days ago. We essentially see these big tech companies making large, very visible plays to come in and get access to patient information. And this is somewhat of a change from what it used to be. There certainly was a paradigm where healthcare companies, traditionally healthcare companies, were migrating into the cloud and hosting their data in the cloud environments. So that was sort of the first big step of movement of data in healthcare. But even in those contexts, the cloud providers typically were not really accessing the data. They were not doing a whole lot other than protecting it where it lived and allowing the healthcare entities to interact with that data as they needed for their businesses. This is somewhat of a different paradigm where these companies are now coming in and saying, we don't want to just hold your data. We actually want to use it. We want to process it in certain ways to help improve care, to innovate, to do lots of interesting things that we weren't able to do before because we didn't have the data, or we certainly didn't have the thinking that big tech, or any tech for that matter, could lend itself to solve healthcare problems. But that gap is being bridged in real time. And it's happening in a few different ways. There are, in big tech scenarios or small tech scenarios, we sort of have three distinct groupings of activities that are happening in the market. You have companies that are starting up that are fit for purpose, quote unquote, that are looking to try to solve discrete problems in healthcare. For example, diabetes management or management of opioid use or other fitness goals, for example. Then you have on the other side companies that are completely agnostic as to the healthcare problems. All they're trying to do is deliver robust infrastructure and services to allow for people to develop and deploy tools that can be used in healthcare paradigms. And then you also have a third bucket, which is healthcare companies that have always been in healthcare who realize that they really need to be innovative and leverage technology in smart ways to become more efficient and improve effectiveness of their operations. And if that's not complicated enough, you also have a lot of market activity in terms of market consolidation. So companies are coming and going overnight. Some are being bought, some are being sold, or otherwise joining forces. So there's a lot of interesting activity happening here, and so I would say just keep an eye on it, and depending on where you sit in the ecosystem, there's some interesting things that you could probably be a part of. Next slide, please. So HIPAA in a nutshell, before we get into where we're going, I think it makes sense to talk a little bit about where we've been and where we are, just to level set. Many of you on the call probably know HIPAA inside and out, maybe better than I do, which I hope. But HIPAA is essentially the federal rule that governs covered entities and their business associates. It's broken down to these four main components: the privacy rule, which relates to how you use and disclose protected health information, patient data, essentially. The security rule, which is about exactly what it sounds like. How do you implement administrative, physical, and technical safeguards to protect the data? And I will say that HIPAA serves as a floor, and what I mean by that is it's pretty flexible, it's not very prescriptive, but it says this is the minimum you need to do to safeguard the data. The federal regulators have always said, we encourage you to do more. And in certain cases, states have said that as well, because they want to make sure that there's additional, more robust protections in place. I plant that seed now because you're going to hear that theme about the floor later on when we talk about other federal legislation. The breach notification rule is really something about telling people if something goes wrong. Has there been an unauthorized access to your data that compromised that privacy or security of that data? In which case you have requirements to notify the government, potentially media, individuals that are affected, et cetera. And then the enforcement rule, which is where the Office for Civil Rights and to some extent other enforcing agencies may come in and apply penalties if you violated the rules. I will say that healthcare, there's a specific need to get this right because of the sensitivity of the information and the cost if something goes wrong. Recent studies have shown that the cost of a data breach, for example, results in cost that equates to about $480, give or take, a record. And as you can imagine, healthcare entities possess way more than one record. They have millions of records. So that you do the math and it becomes a really costly proposition. So getting security right, getting privacy right is really important in this context. And the regulators recognize this as well. And so very recently, at the tail end of last year, or middle of last year, there was an RFI released asking for advice to overhaul HIPAA. How do we improve this body of law that's sort of aging at this point? Aging because data is being shared outside of the HIPAA arena and creating a whole bunch of privacy concerns. Aging because when they wrote the rule, computers were barely a thing, and now that's the only way we operate. Cybersecurity risk wasn't really a thing in 1996 when the Act was passed. So we really are seeing the world change, and as Alice pointed out, regulation and legislation is certainly not keeping pace. Next slide, please. I think I mentioned this, the people who are subject to HIPAA, it's a pretty limited scope of folks. It's covered entities, which you see healthcare providers, health plans, and clearinghouses, and their business associates. And increasingly, the business associate bucket is the one that's getting a lot of attention because it's a very broad category. And many companies that aren't familiar with HIPAA or just the heavy regulation in healthcare generally find that HIPAA is the first lesson they need to learn because they try to do business with a covered entity and realize that, hey, I need to sign a business associate agreement as a gatekeeping exercise. And by doing that, I'm also, coming into this realm where I have lots of privacy and security requirements and direct liability under HIPAA. So it's becoming table stakes, and a lot of technology companies that are trying to get access to data don't necessarily appreciate that they fall into this business associate bucket oftentimes. So there is nuance, and of course, you're not always a business associate. We could talk a little bit more about that, but it is something that companies that aren't as well-versed in healthcare should appreciate, that there is a body of law that they may need to comply with that they never thought about in the first instance. And the other point I'll make about that is vendor management is so critical. As data is being shared, you need to be able to share it responsibly with entities that you know and can trust to take care of this information for the consumers, ultimately, the patients. And so vetting vendors through these processes, doing diligence on them, and ultimately managing them even after the fact of engagement is going to be really critical to make sure that information is being used appropriately and safeguarded. Next slide, please. So one of the things that is sort of dovetailing from the consumerism piece in healthcare is that the rules around HIPAA's individual right to access are becoming front and center. Very recently, actually, in a HIPAA NIST summit and in other contexts as well, the director of OCR, Office for Civil Rights, Roger Severino, he took the podium and he said, "This is one of my top priorities. I want to ensure that patients are empowered to be able to get access to their data and bring it with them to where they need to be healthier. And that may involve moving data outside of what is a typically HIPAA-regulated space and putting it in some third-party app, for example, where I'm getting innovative ways to take care of myself." So again, the theme is really changing where we're trying to put the patient at the center of their care, a la consumerism. And there's some guidance that was released recently. I encourage you to take a look at it. I think that the push, and this is a push not just within the Office for Civil Rights, but some of the other agencies we'll talk about, like the Office of the National Coordinator and HHS broadly under their regulatory sprint, is that we're trying to sort of push innovation further, and we're trying to use data that's been captured by the traditionally regulated healthcare space and move it into the hands of people who are more innovative than the traditionally regulated space has been. So that basically is creating this paradigm where we're moving data in large quantity and in mass from, you could imagine it like moving it from the halls of, you know, your hallowed hospitals into the hands of Silicon Valley, where all the tech companies live and are iterating and creating new health apps and new devices. But that creates some privacy concerns. I think Alice pointed out that point earlier, where you're essentially taking something that has, you know, a body of law that governs it in terms of privacy and security and putting it into a place where there's really a gap. There's not a whole lot of regulation to govern how people use and disclose this information. And it's a lot of sort of a buyer beware paradigm where the companies that are trying to get access to this data, they'll publish their own privacy policy and their own terms of use that will apply to this data now, which oftentimes are lacking in terms of transparency, other notice requirements, and are oftentimes contracts of adhesion, quite frankly. So, so really the consumer is taking all the risk in that context. So next slide, please. And one other thing I'll say before I jump into this is that the Office for Civil Rights has become more aggressive on the patient right of access piece. So there's been a couple of enforcement actions around that recently. So keep an eye on this as a hot area. They're certainly still chasing down the data breaches and dealing with security issues as well. But I think that the patient right of access, especially in the context of what's happening with the ONC, which I'll talk about in a second, is a critical linking of two regulatory authorities trying to work in concert to, again, empower the patient to help with a consumer-driven healthcare paradigm and move data from point A to point B. So the Office of the National Coordinator, ONC, recently proposed rules around interoperability and prohibiting information blocking. Those rules were issued early last year. They have gone through a notice and comment period. We believe, based on what I'm hearing, that the final rules are actually fairly imminent. They're going to be likely issued sometime prior to the State of the Union address coming up in a few weeks. But again, it's sort of a wait and see because obviously the world is a complicated place given what's going on with the current impeachment process and the Iran conflict issues. You know, it's hard to know exactly the cadence of which this will come out, but I have heard some things that suggest it will come out pretty soon. In terms of the overarching theme of this, and this is coming from Dr. Rucker, the the current coordinator at ONC, this is really a body of regulation that is trying to accelerate the movement of data at the direction of patients, largely to spur innovation. Essentially, power this engine of innovation around digital health, big data, and other paradigms that currently can't get access to data the way that healthcare providers and payers and other covered entities are able to today. The crux of the interoperability rules is really about prohibiting information blocking. So essentially, we're trying to say, if you have the data and the patient directs the data to go somewhere else, you're really not allowed to stop that process. And that fits in line with what OCR's guidance is with regard to patients' rights of access as well. But if you do engage in information blocking, there are statutory penalties that stem directly from the 21st Century Cures Act, which say that there's a $1 million penalty enforceable by the Office of Inspector General. So there are stiff fines for this. They certainly want to put their stake in the sand and say data needs to flow, and patients should be empowered to allow that to flow. Interestingly, this new body of proposed rules changes the posture by which ONC has operated historically. ONC used to be regulating technology. They would regulate certified electronic health record technology and make sure that it had the features it needed to bolster meaningful use and allow for robust collection and processing of data for patient care. But with this new proposed regulation, ONC has now taken the posture of a regulator of entities. So the way that they've positioned these rules is that they now are governing the conduct of providers, certified health IT developers, health information exchanges, and health information networks. So it's just an interesting shift, and we'll see how ONC deals with that, given that they haven't had much experience with that previously. I think that it's certainly something worth noting and worth watching. The other key things about this proposed rule is that they take a very broad view of the data that should move from point A to point B. They call it electronic health information, quote unquote EHI, in the proposed rules, and it's sort of this broad brush definition. The comment period raised a bunch of concerns around this. Pretty consistently, people wanted more clarity on the scope of what that meant, because no one wants to be called an information blocker if they don't quite appreciate how much data needs to go from point A to point B. Other focus from a technology perspective is a big focus on APIs. That's the mechanism to get things in and out of systems from point A to point B. So a lot of new changes and a lot of new requirements, especially for providers and their health IT companies that they rely on, especially EHR companies. So to the extent that you work with one of these kinds of companies, you should definitely have this on your radar. I will say that there were some surveys done in the last 6 months or so of CIOs and CTOs in companies, and the results of that were quite alarming. There was a study that said there were only about 18% of folks actually were aware of this rule, which means that there's a real large gap in terms of awareness and education around what this rule is about and how it might impact healthcare companies. Next slide, please. So just continuing on, there's just a couple of other things. One of the things that the rule is trying to do is promote greater transparency from the health IT developers, and they prohibit sort of gag clauses in contracting so that people can talk more freely about their experience with certain health IT vendors. There's also two different paradigms for data moving from point A to point B. Again, number one is patient-directed. This is, again, back to the consumerism point. And that's going to be, if I want to move my data from, let's say XYZ hospital to this killer app I found in the App Store, I can direct that data to move that way. Number two is vendor switching. So because of a lot of complaints that have been heard in the industry around relationships between providers and their health records companies that they use, the rule contemplates allowing for smooth transfer of data if a provider chooses to switch records, and that's sort of a bulk transfer. What I will say is what this rule does is really puts their foot on the gas with regard to accelerating some of these privacy concerns that we're facing, because essentially they're saying, yes, we want to move everything from point A to point B. Point A being traditionally regulated by HIPAA, point B being regulated by some light touch state laws, the FTC to some extent, but most in a sort of after the fact enforcement posture. So there's sort of this gap, and all prior commissioners of the ONC actually wrote a letter after these rules were issued, and while they applauded the proposed rule for its intent, did point out the significant gap in privacy protections for moving things from the regulated space into this unregulated space. And you'll see that some of the federal activity we'll talk about is in relation to what's been pointed out with regard to that. Next slide, please. So what's the FTC's role? As I mentioned earlier, the FTC is the consumer protection organization that really has been left holding the bag, for lack of a better way of saying it. As the data is migrating out of the HIPAA environment where OCR really has jurisdiction, the FTC is then the enforcement agency in large part, looking to protect consumers' privacy. And the FTC commissioners have agreed with what the ONC commissioners have said in terms of the lack of privacy protections. And they also pointed out that the FTC, now having this larger sort of mandate to protect privacy while data is moving out of the HIPAA space, have asked for additional authority and resources to be able to fit that role. So we have yet to see how FTC will be able to take on this additional burden, and they're certainly contemplated as actors in a lot of the federal legislation we'll talk about in a second. The FTC does have existing authority, and it's pretty broad authority under Section 5 of the FTC Act, which prohibits unfair methods of competition and deceptive practices. And they've certainly leveraged that in the context of healthcare and privacy. So we'll look to see them continue to do so. The question really in my mind is, if the FTC is really becoming the enforcing agency for any data that moves out of HIPAA space, then, is there going to be
Did we lose Alaap?
I think we lost him.
Okay,
I wonder
guys.
if he knows.
Give Alaap a moment to call back in. Alice, do you think you can pick up on some of these slides? I hope we didn't lose Alice. Are you on mute, Alice? Okay. Well, it would not be an e-health webinar without some technical difficulties. So thank you.
I'll send him
Are you there, Alice? Okay.
I'm going to send Alaap a quick note. I'm sorry, everyone. We don't know what happened.
This is Alice. Do you want me to...
Oh, yeah, Alice. Perfect. Yeah, if you want to keep going, and Claudia, you can try to get Alaap back with us.
Yeah.
Okay, Alice, maybe you want to pick up on this FTC role in consumer-directed health?
Sure. So I think we can finish up on the FTC front just by saying that the FTC has shouldered a large part of the burden in enforcing the privacy obligations of the consumer-directed health apps. And while they're doing the best they can, the FTC wasn't really designed, and certainly not the commission, to enforce this vast trove of consumer health data. And so while they're doing the best they can now, we're really focused on finding ways to bolster other protections so that the FTC isn't left shouldering the entire burden. The next slide. Well, I touched on this briefly before, but the big news on the privacy legal front in recent years was the GDPR. And while it might not have seemed like such a big deal to a lot of US citizens, there's no way you haven't all noticed the pop-up boxes that have appeared on a large proportion of the sites that we all visit that involve data collection. The general data protection regulation came out of the EU a few years ago, and it became effective in 2018. And it applies to all European Union resident personal data, really focused on transparency, notice, and consent, right to access, the right to erasure. Here we talk a little bit about the right to be forgotten, is maybe a more familiar term in the US, includes some data breach reporting requirements as well. But it has affected US companies as well because it has an extraterritorial reach. Any entity that controls or processes personal data, even if there's not a physical presence in the EU, is subject to this. So there was a huge amount of press and attention given to this regulation. The stiff penalties, you see these enormous fines, were incredibly important as well. So again, the reason that this has been relevant, not only because it affects so many US companies and even US consumers, is that it really signals where we might want to go when it comes to US comprehensive privacy regulation. I should say that the law does not apply specifically to health data, though there are some health implications for health data, but we have talked a lot in the US policy space about whether or not we need something like a GDPR.
Hi, Alice. I'm back. I apologize. I got dropped. And thanks for covering the GDPR slides.
Anything you want to add on EU?
No, I think you covered it. And I will add, though, that the eHealth initiative is going to be doing additional, more deeper dive sessions with regard to the GDPR. So for anyone interested in this topic, certainly stay tuned for those future webinars. Next slide, please. So shifting gears a little bit, we'll talk a little bit about the state of affairs with regard to state law development. And this is, the last couple of years have been really, really turbulent with regard to these activities. We see every state stepping up and trying to do something for the most part, some of which more successful than others. As you can see here, there's been a lot of activity in the places we'd expect, which is California and New York. Some other states that are ones to watch are Illinois. Nevada just passed something very recently, and I think that there's other efforts going on in Washington as well to resurrect a bill that failed the first time around but is back on the table. You know, the key states to be watching, we'll talk a little bit about California in a second, but New York passed the New York Shield Act, which imposes some interesting requirements around privacy and especially data security, which come online in March. So if anyone's operating in New York and processing New York resident data, I think that's a bill to be watching. And in terms of Nevada and in terms of Washington, those are a little more aggressive on the privacy side and will align closer to what California has done, but have, you know, are sort of more nascent stage at this point. Next slide, please. So every state has at least a data breach notification law. They vary in terms of their definition of personal information, and they certainly vary in terms of what requirements exist in terms of data breach triggers and what you need to tell and who you need to tell. So depending on where you operate, it is this sort of, you know, patchwork of requirements often. So you know, it's something worth watching. There is some effort to try to create a federal level data breach notification rule to harmonize, but that's been put on the table a number of times and has failed. So we'll see if this year or maybe perhaps next will be a year that it actually makes it through. And then trends in state law, like I said, California Consumer Protection Act is one that I certainly am going to talk about in a second and should be on top of mind for a lot of folks. This is probably the most robust state law that's been passed. It is what people are dubbing a mini GDPR. So taking a page out of the EU's book and trying to implement something like that here in relative to California resident information and California companies. Other ones that I point out, in Illinois, there's a Biometric Information Privacy Act that's pretty narrowly tailored, but is something interesting to watch because it's one of the first of its kind. Nevada I mentioned earlier, and New York I mentioned as well. Next slide, please. So I'll go through this quickly, and I'll also reiterate that EHI is going to take a deeper dive on the California Consumer Privacy Act. So, so this is just a high-level touch for you, but especially because it just came online January 1st. So there is, I will say, a delay in enforcement. The state attorney general in California has said that they're going to take a wait-and-see approach. Probably you get a 6-month runway to try to comply with this if you're subject to it. So we're also waiting for regulations to finalize relative to this body of law as well. So what does it govern really? It governs personal information from California consumers, and it does a few things. It talks about the categories of personal information it collects. You have to have pretty robust notice around what you're collecting on a pretty granular basis. And then you need to tell people what you're doing with it, whether you're selling it or not, or sharing it with third parties. This is a key point because there are some additional requirements and rights afforded to consumers around whether or not their data can be used for sale or sharing with third parties. There are some opt-out provisions and things like that. And then ultimately, when it relates to federal law, especially in the healthcare context, there is a carve-out for data that's covered already by the HIPAA privacy rules. So if you are subject to HIPAA and apply HIPAA privacy protections to data, that data would not be also subject to the California Consumer Privacy Act. Next slide, please. So one of the interesting facets of CCPA is the right to request deletion. So the right to be forgotten, as some people call it, or the right to erasure. And this is something that's very new for U.S. law, or U.S. state law specifically. This is something that was in the GDPR, and so again, California is sort of taking charge and taking the lead on this kind of thing. But you'll see that this concept of the right to request deletion is something that's making its way into federal legislation as well. And again, I mentioned about consumers have more rights with regard to directing how their data is being used, especially in the context of sale. There are still things in flux, so I want to point those out. There are several amendments that have passed in 2019 before the General Assembly in California closed their session, and there are certainly things that are on the table still moving forward. The big one is that employee data is not subject to CCPA, at least for this year. They're going to revisit this issue and figure out if employee data should be governed by this body of law as well. And then there's some clarifications when it comes to sharing of information that's de-identified, and also with regard to some of the avenues by which consumers can reach out to you with regard to their rights. Next slide, please. So shifting gears, this is the really interesting stuff that's happening, because as we pointed out, there's all these different ways that privacy is being regulated. You have healthcare specific bills, you have state level bills, you have things that are happening in the international space. So clearly there's just a disjointed way that people are trying to solve for this privacy conundrum we're facing. So the federal government is stepping in, at least trying to pass something. This is obviously a very difficult climate within which to pass legislation generally because of the nature of the Congress and its makeup. Today, there's obviously difficulty with regard to some of the other issues that are happening in the United States, as I mentioned earlier. And it's also an election year. So, layer all those things on top of each other, it's really hard to get things passed in these kinds of climates. So we'll have to wait and see if any of these actually advance. Currently, all the bills remain under committee review, and there's probably still that are going to be proposed over time. The majority of the bills, they do contain certain elements. They create private rights of action. Some of them create independent data protection agencies or augment authority of other agencies to take on that role. As with many of the other laws we talked about in the state and federal level, we are seeing rights being afforded to consumers around this data in terms of access, controlling, deleting. Preemption is being addressed. And then there's this algorithmic transparency piece around AI and tracking and retargeting. That's certainly something that's come up into the focus because of the push into AI that people are doing, and certainly how ad companies have been targeting folks relative to the personal information they're gathering on people. there's still a lot to do. It's likely that while whatever law passes will offer some level of preemption of state law, for example, most of the laws do contemplate that more stringent state laws would still apply. So likely we're left with, again, a patchwork to some extent where you're going to have to navigate at a federal level and, depending on where you operate, at a state level as well. So we'll have yet to see that. And we'll also have to see, what the federal government does with regard to establishing standards. A lot of the bills talk about setting a floor, essentially a beachhead, whereby, this is the minimum that organizations need to do to protect personal information. And then we'll look to states or others to privately choose more rigorous standards. Next slide, please. So there's a couple of bills to watch. I didn't have a whole lot of real estate, so I focused on the more comprehensive bill. This is the Consumer Online Privacy Rights Act, Cobra. It was introduced very recently, and it's introduced by a number of senators, as you see here. One of the interesting facets of who sponsored this, Senator Klobuchar and Senator Markey also have other bills similar in nature that are being considered as well. So you'll see that Senator Markey and Klobuchar are very active in this space and are likely going to be pioneering a lot of this and getting political buy-in. So whatever they attach their name to, I would watch closely. This is currently being reviewed by the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Technology, or Science and Transportation, excuse me. So again, it is one of the things that have bubbled up, but it's yet to be determined what to do next. This law, has explicit provisions for preemption, and it talks about the AI piece and bias and discrimination. It also creates the private right of action so people can enforce themselves. And this one, unlike some of the others, does augment FTC's authority. So again, puts FTC in the driver's seat with regard to enforcement. Next slide, please. And before I go into this, I'm not going to go through the whole slide, but one of the other bills I'll put on the radar is called the Protecting Personal Health Data Act. And this is another bill that Senator Klobuchar sponsored. It's actually a bipartisan bill, also sponsored by Senator Murkowski, if I'm not mistaken. This is actually a health-specific bill, and it's looking to address the specific gap that we talked about earlier with data moving from point A to point B under the ONC rules and some of the patient right of access rules. So this is something that's regulating direct-to-consumer health apps and devices and direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies and the data that they're gathering from consumers. So as data moves again, we really are trying to fill the gap, and that's what that bill is trying to do. So when you look at the meta level at all these bills, you see some interesting things. You see that from a definition perspective, all of them tend to have a definition of what personal data is, just the scope, the reach of this. In terms of establishing a data protection agency, they're a little bit all over the map, but the place where you see the gaps is where FTC is really being charged with taking the reins of data protection. Individual rights is a pretty commonplace thing. It's likely going to end up in whatever bill gets passed. And then there's a few that are probably not going to end up, at least in whole, being in the final bill. You're going to have some debate around how much data people can collect and can it be a take it or leave it kind of engagement. These are things that tech companies are going to likely push back on, and rightfully, because they need to provide the services and sometimes need data to do so. The other interesting thing I'll point out is that there's no bill that currently contemplates limiting the government's access to personal information that may be held by another company. So again, we're still dealing with that issue of the government trying to get access to data as well. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. I tee it up to say, look, there's a lot of different activity. HIPAA certainly has its limitations. We talked about that. We have movement of data into unregulated spaces. We have variability among sort of privacy and security laws from a state, federal, and international level. And we have some states sort of pushing ahead trying to carve out space here, like California. we'll see now how that translates. Is the federal government going to be successful passing sort of an overarching privacy regime similar to what happened in the EU? We have yet to see. There's a lot of reasons why it might not happen. So my prediction, at least for 2020, is that we're still going to see a sort of unharmonious smattering of laws that we're going to have to track and navigate. So next slide, please. And I think it'll still be a patchwork. I think it's still going to be something that is going to be complex to navigate, but I would say keep an eye on the federal legislation. It will move forward at some point in time, and I'll be interested to see how the dust settles once that happens. So thank you for that time, and sorry for dropping off. My apologies before. Alice, did you want to raise some of these questions? I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Alaap. That was a lot of information presented really succinctly, and there's a lot in there. So we're so grateful to you for being part of this. We teed up some discussion questions, but given the time, I thought we'd jump directly to the Q&A that some people have asked. And I will read the questions, and then Alaap, you're welcome to jump in, or I'm happy to answer them as well. So the first one that we have is the following. As we look to social determinants of health and other similar information that sits at the intersection of non-traditional health data and consumer behavior, is there different data privacy obligations that data analytic firms need to address? Alaap, do you want to take this? I have some thoughts I'm happy to share as well.
Yeah, maybe I'll start and you can jump in. I think that with social determinants of health, because you started getting into the realm of socioeconomics and some of the other things that are more personal in nature that are outside of clinical aspects, we have to start thinking about discrimination and bias and access issues around that. So I think that's a facet that doesn't always come into play in some of the more traditionally issues. Alice, I don't know if you have something else to add.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't mean to punt to the rest of the presentation, but one of the things that's so interesting about health data is that it both requires special protections because it's a unique type of data. It's not just personal data. It's just seen as different and more sensitive, but it also in some ways is more important to share because its value is greater. And so this is something SDOH in particular that the feds have been talking a lot about. There have been a couple of roundtables on this, and what's come out of it is sort of a multifaceted approach, shoring up business associate agreements. Most data analytics firms have signed a BAA, and those obligations need to be clearer, more enforceable. The companies need to be more accountable, and those that are subject to a BAA need to be more transparent about what they're doing with it, because Alaap, as you point out, some of the risks are greater. It's not just a HIPAA gap. There's not just a HIPAA gap or HIPAA update solution. There's some gap filling that needs to be done. And then every time we talk about SDOH, we always talk about the consumer education component, because again, so much of this data is being shared without a full understanding of how it's being used and how it could potentially be used down the road, even if it's de-identified. There was another question that related to the CCPA and potential amendments. I'm going to hold on that one just because, as I said, or Alaap said, we're going to be doing an EHI webinar on the CCPA and the GDPR, and we're going to talk a lot about the various iterations of the California law and the amendments that are currently in the works. There was another question from a medical device manufacturer that says, there's a conflict between technical feasibility, security, and interoperable data flow. We can show to authorized parties, but we have no intention to share data with EHRs. Are we out of compliance? I think this question came up during the information blocking portion, the ONC portion. Alaap, do you have an answer for that?
That's interesting. So going back to the ONC's authority, they essentially are now regulating providers, health IT developers, so EHR companies, and the health information networks and exchanges. So medical device manufacturers themselves are not, quote unquote, in that grouping. So I think you would not have sort of direct requirements or liability under that body of law, but the providers that you are using your technologies, for example, may, or if the data the consumer is trying to get ultimately lives in your device and needs to get out somehow. It may be the health tech company, like the EHR company, that needs to work with you to get the data out. So it's a way of saying you, I think, are not on the hook, but someone you work with is.
Great. I think that's all the Q&A we have, and perfect timing. I applaud the technical glitches because it brought us exactly to 3 o'clock. I really want to thank everybody for joining. As we've hopefully made clear, the slides are available. If for whatever reason you can't see them, you're welcome to contact anyone at EHI and we will send them out to you. And I want to thank Alaap again, who's not officially an EHI employee, but we're so grateful to have brought you into the fold to help us with these presentations. Stay tuned for our invitation to our next privacy webinars. I think it's going to be a HIPAA for, I don't want to say dummies, no one's a dummy, but a deep dive on HIPAA, and we've got some other exciting ones over the course of the spring and summer. So thank you again, and we will hopefully talk to you all soon.
Thank you.